I am based in Ottawa, Canada, which is just a couple of hours down the road from the Climate Reality Project Canada office in my hometown of Montreal. In Ottawa, we say that we're on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And there's been a lot of just the beginning of a lot of long overdue recognition in Canada that any of us who are not of Indigenous background are more often than not sitting and standing and working on stolen land. So but for those of you who aren't familiar with that, there are more and more land acknowledgements being done at the beginning of presentations in Ottawa. And again, that's long overdue. As you mentioned, Schultz, thank you so much for the recommendation for the energy mix. And I did take the liberty of putting our web address in the chat. The Energy Mix is a news site and twice weekly e-digest on climate change, energy, and the shift off carbon. I launched the publication in May 2014, and at this point we're a team of about 12.5 full-time, part-time, casual people, just basically scanning about 1,200 news headlines per week to try to get a sense of what's going on out there, because the news keeps accelerating as the issues, the crisis, and the opportunities keep accelerating, and trying to find the most useful news, if only just to help our readers short circuit their own daily news search by having at least one place where they can look for not everything they'll need, but some of the material that will help us all be more effective with whatever aspect of the climate emergency we're working on. Sophia, I so appreciated the way you framed the problem, and I put a comment in the chat that I've been known to enjoy science fiction from time to time over the years and decades, but the deeper I get into climate work, the more impatient I am with the fiction. And until you made that connection, I didn't realize why. You know, I'll sort of grumble at the fiction event, that'll never happen, but sort of the reverse of what you've said. You've just helped connect that, and I really appreciate it. And I think it's a really interesting point about the way that the culture deliberately or otherwise propagandizes the kind of techno-washing that you're talking about. What came to mind when you showed that wonderful slide with the unrealistic images of different, carbon techno fixes, is that all of those images probably came out of the public relations office, not out of the engineering office, not out of the project management office. It's easy to produce a drawing and say we've solved the problem, but if the details aren't behind it, then as you say, that's techno washing. And one really good example, we aren't talking about nuclear reactors today, although I guess we can get into that in the Q&A, but there's been a lot of talk in Canada and in other parts of the world now about so-called small modular nuclear reactors, which is supposed to be the next generation of nuclear power that will actually come in on time and on budget and somehow save us from climate change. The analysis I've seen that I like best essentially says that these are PowerPoint reactors. They look great on a slide, but they've never been developed. They've never been designed. This is an industry that's never brought anything on budget or on time or safely, even when they thought they knew what they were doing. So just a quick word on techno-optimism in general is that I would say we're in a situation where and I didn't hear you suggest that we should be writing up all technologies, but the test comes from one of my all-time favorite quotes, which came from the American naturalist Henry David Thoreau, who said, if you've built your castles in the air, your work need not be lost. That's where they should be. Now put a foundation under them. And I think that's the standard we need to apply, whether it's to the technologies we think we might want to use, or the technologies we're pretty sure we're critical of and nervous about. If the details are there, if it actually works, if it's a technology that will really help us decarbonize, if it's a technology that can do that quickly enough and effectively to help us get to 45% by 2030, because as we all know, that's the deadline the IPCC has had us all on since 2018. If it's a technology that really puts communities first and promotes energy democracy, if it's a technology that allows us to create and sustain social systems that leave no one behind, that's what I would suggest as the criteria and the fair and realistic standards that distinguish potentially or actually useful technologies. And I do think there are many useful ones that are ready for prime time and practical and affordable now, that distinguishes that cluster of technology from the ones that you've just been talking about. It's a different idea of the wonders of technology than what we hear from advocates of centralized energy and what we hear from advocates that are trying to sustain the fossil fuel era. But the arguments would be along the lines of, if we make this change, if we do deep energy retrofits on every home and commercial building, if we get to the point where nobody again ever has to choose between food and fuel, that transition depends on technologies like heat pumps and insulation. But it's a very different storyline from what we've been hearing from the fossil industry and its boosters. If we hear that electrified transit by expanding will make people's lives easier and reduce their commute, give them more hours back in their day, give us all more hours back in our day, while simultaneously cutting carbon. Again, that's not the kind of benefit we hear from the fossil industry, except very inferentially and very vaguely. It's not something that they can deliver on. And if we get these choices right, I'd like to hope, and I'd be really curious about your take on this, Sophia, that if people can see that these choices are working and are working in their lives, not just to cut carbon, but to give people and households and neighborhoods the things that we already know we need and want in our lives, that'll help insulate us from the techno watching, because we'll have a hands-on sense that there's something else that actually works. You know, and we're not going to get that done overnight, but frankly, neither are they. So you know, let's start. As an example of precarious techno-optimism, and I love the title of this session, carbon capture and storage has been under development since 1977. Interest in it has increased in recent years as the understanding of the depth of the climate emergency has become wider and deeper. And yes, there's still lots of climate denial out there, but I think there is a lot more concern, a lot more focus on solutions, which is what's given rise to this techno-watching and techno-optimism. I've already referred to the 1.5 degree report that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced in 2018, which put us on a 2030 deadline to cut global emissions by at least 45%. And from there, the question of how to get that done has put a lot of attention on one word, and that is unabated. Last year, after so many years of advocacy and arm twisting and analysis and persuasion, the International Energy Agency in May 2021 produced an analysis that said that in their 1.5 degree scenario for 2050, there is no room for any new coal, oil, or gas development. They saw all of those technology, all of those fossil options declining drastically through the middle of the century. But the word unabated got in there, and that was the get out of jail free card. Because if you can imagine that you could build a fossil plant and just bolt on some very effective technology, let me be the first to tell you that, that could capture the carbon and then store it underground indefinitely with no problems, no hitches, no leakage, and do it affordably, well, sure, go ahead. If it's still cost effective against 1 cent per kilowatt hour solar, go ahead, build your fossil fuel plant. It goes that line of thinking. As it happens, the IEA released its 2022 scenario this morning. So a bunch of us are still trying to absorb the details, but they do still see a major role for carbon capture. And by the way, they see a major role for nuclear technologies that, as I was saying before, are at the moment another technological pipe dream. And even though its proponents claim that there's a role, that there's a contribution by 2030, it really looks somewhere between highly unlikely and impossible. But carbon capture and storage is the technology of choice for anybody who assumes that the transition off fossil fuels will necessarily be slow and gradual, who assumes that whatever we do, we're still going to need large volumes of oil and gas for decades, even though, given half a chance, we see the shift to renewable energy and energy efficiency speeding up before our eyes. So really a shorter way of saying that, maybe I need to start getting shorter about these things, is that CCS is essentially a lifeline for fossil fuel companies that don't want to stop what they're doing, that are determined to keep on extracting fossil fuels and emitting carbon. And in Canada, we're in a situation, just briefly, where our federal government modeling agency, which produces a national equivalent to the annual IEA modeling, is currently projecting that we're going to continue increasing our tar sands and shale and other fossil fuel extraction through the year 2032. And I think, if I remember correctly, there was an assumption in last year's modeling that, oh, you know, it's okay, by 2030, almost 2/3, or maybe by 2050, 2/3 of that will be abated. Which brings us to a few factors that make carbon capture such a deeply questionable technology at this time, 45 years after the first development project began. First of all, this may not be the primary concern for any of this on the for any of us on this call, but it's certainly something that should concern any CCS proponent. They've really been having trouble making it work in the real world, and they've been having trouble bringing it in on budget. A fantastic resource, if you just write down IEEFA, IEEF for Frank, A.org, the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, which is why you should use their acronym, published a study last month or early this. It was an exhaustive review of carbon capture projects that are so far in existence around the world. They looked at 13 projects that were large enough to represent about 55% of the total CCS capacity around the world. And they found that 10 of those 13 projects either underperformed, failed outright, or it had to be mothballed. They had to be shut down. So after 45 years of development, carbon capture and storage is still more likely to fail than it is to succeed. More broadly, we've been following this for years, and so often CCS projects will go into service with great promises and fantastic hopes. I mean, how can you not be a techno-optimist when you see the amazing perfection of what they're offering? And then, you know, 6 months later, they're over budget, and, you know, however many years later, the project folds. We've seen carbon capture plants in different parts of North America either shut down or sustained just because it was too politically embarrassing to shut them down, but it doesn't mean that they were meeting their targets, and it doesn't mean they were meeting their budget. Earlier this month, the Global CCS Institute, which is, I suppose they probably do technical work with it, the International Advocacy Group for Carbon Capture and Storage, they published a report that talked about the massive increase in interest in new CCS projects around the world, especially in the United States, and I'm sorry to say in Canada. So rejoice, we're all saved, right? We're, you know, carbon capture is going to ride to our rescue and save the day. If all of the projects get built, which we know they might not, and if they all work as they're supposed to, which we know is pretty unlikely with the information currently available to us, hold on to your seats before you hear this amazing statistic. They'll capture 244 million tons of carbon dioxide per year, which sounds great to anyone who doesn't know that that's less than 1% of the 36 billion tons of emissions that humanity was responsible for in 2021. So after 45 years of development, with lots of optimistic assumptions about technology that has not even yet been built, we're still below 1% carbon capture when the IPCC has given us a 2030 deadline for 45%. I believe that they can catch up, don't you? I probably shouldn't be sarcastic. It won't come across quite right on a transcript. None of which stopped the CEO of the Institute from hyping the potential of the technology. And here's what he said, a verbatim quote: CCS is the Swiss Army knife of climate mitigation. It will continue to play multiple unique roles in decarbonizing the global economy. Many essential industries like cement and chemical production have no other viable path for deep decarbonization other than CCS. And if you want an example of something that came out of the PR office, not the engineering office, not the project management office, I think that one's probably a good start. Another really scary and worrying aspect of carbon capture that we frankly don't have to worry about anymore in Canada because our government has ruled out this particular use of it. As recently as January 2021, so not quite 2 years ago, more than just over 1/5 of the carbon that was being captured worldwide was being used for another term that came out of a PR office for a process called enhanced oil recovery. So what happens is that as oil wells are depleted because fossil companies are extracting from them, they begin to become less productive. They can't pump oil as fast because they're starting to run out. There isn't as much pressure underground, whatever the technical reasons are, they become less efficient in the operational sense that matters to fossil companies. But wait, we're capturing all this carbon, almost 1% of the global total. We're capturing all this carbon. Why don't we just inject it into the well? And that'll help bring out the last oil more efficiently. More than 4/5 of the carbon that is captured in the name of decarbonization, as recently as January 2021, was being injected underground again to do what? Extract more oil. So you have this cycle. I'm sure the response to that would be, oh, it's okay because we'll capture the carbon from that oil too. But at a time when we have to hit 45% by 2030, that's got to be the height of techno washing, the height of techno optimism. Yeah, to suggest that anywhere in the universe, that's something that anyone should be doing. So after all this, we're looking for the right mix of policies, technologies, financing, behavior changes that'll get us to that 45% by 2030. And there is nothing in the way CCS is developing, nothing in what technology developers like to call sort of the technology path, nothing in the way it's progressing in their terms, that suggests that it's a realistic part of any solution for 2030. And I would frankly be, raise serious questions about throwing good money after bad into it in the hopes of it doing anything by 2050. That's partly because of the opportunity cost. When political discussions are tied down in technologies that are all spin and no substance, when financing and public subsidies are directed to those technologies, then all of those scarce resources that we have as humanity to try to do something real about the climate emergency, all those resources are being diverted into something that only exists on paper. So it's a waste of our time. It's a waste of our attention, which might be the scarcest resource of all these days. It's a waste of our money. It's a waste of our time, which is the other scarce resource. The best argument I've ever heard for carbon capture and storage is that, sure, yeah, it'll never work for fossil fuels, but if the industry wants to invest in it while they're on the way out the door, as the fossil industry declines, maybe the one socially useful thing they can do is develop this technology so that it will be available to other hard to abate sectors. So these are heavy industries, and the Global CCS Institute representative mentioned cement and chemical production. Others are steel, petrochemicals, fertilizer. I think there are 7 or 8 or 9 heavy industries where it's a legitimate question. They have ways to decarbonize. Those options are not currently fully developed and ready for prime time. It's important in looking at those options to keep front and center the points we've just heard from Sophia about not allowing, techno washing and techno optimism to consume that. But then again, I think it's a fair point. If we want to build massive numbers of wind turbines to generate non-fossil electricity, we don't yet know how to do that with cement or steel. I don't expect we'll know how in our lifetime. But when you look more deeply into those sectors, and I am not a specialist in hard to abate industries, so I won't claim that I have the whole picture. I don't. But even as a relatively casual observer of that side of the story, I do know that the steel industry has been quickly moving into electric arc furnaces from coal-fired steel production, which will mean that, yes, they'll need wind turbines and solar panels and potentially other sources of renewables, but they won't need to capture the carbon that comes off the coal that they're no longer using. There is talk of green hydrogen with the caveat that we just heard earlier down the road for steel. Petrochemicals need to go away anyway, and that's a longer conversation. I don't know that that conversation is concluded yet, but it doesn't mean that the solution to petrochemicals that are produced from fossil fuels and plastics produced from fossil fuels, the solution to that is not to bolt carbon capture and storage on. With that, industry needs to change fundamentally or go away, and that gets into the circularity conversation we just briefly heard earlier, and changes in broader practices. There's a really interesting point, if I have time for it, Charles, about one of the industries, and that is fertilizer. And what I'm about to say, I want to be really clear, has a question mark at the end of it, not an exclamation point. It's something I'm really interested in looking into. The fact that I'm interested in looking into it does not by any means mean that this makes sense. Okay, looking into it might show that it's totally wrong, so I won't take up too much of your time with it. But if we have a choice, and this is an issue in Canada because we've just devoted 7.1 billion Canadian dollars through 2030 to carbon capture and storage subsidies. And one of the arguments is that it's for hard to abate sectors like fertilizer. If we have a choice between bolting a carbon capture device onto a nitrogen fertilizer facility, of which we have a bunch, or recognizing that when that fertilizer reaches a farm, its byproduct is nitrous oxide, which is, if I remember correctly, 285 times more potent to greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And yet, if we attach carbon capture to nitrogen fertilizer production, we're tacitly accepting that that's okay. And we'll just take incremental approaches to reducing those nitrous emissions. It takes talent. They're even worse than methane, lots worse, 3 times worse, more. So my what if question that could be wrong is, what is the fastest, cheapest, most durable, most community-based way to cut a ton of carbon? Do we do it by underpinning this nitrogen fertilizer economy that needs to fundamentally change anyway? Or do we put the money into farm-based practices that allow farmers to sequester more carbon in their soil, build the productivity of their soil, and therefore the profitability of their small and medium farms, supports rural and farm communities, keeps people at work on farms that are especially marginal now with high interest rates and commodity costs, including fertilizer. Fertilizer's been going through the roof since the war. So what's the best way to use that money? The part of it goes into the fertilizer sector. I've just framed it like a conclusion, and it's just a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is allowed to be wrong. If we learn something from it, that's why we don't call it a conclusion. But that different line of thinking, I think, is maybe just one small part, but one part of the solution to the kind of, techno-optimism and techno-washing that we're here to talk about, because there's a solution that really works from the ground up. I don't need to tell people in the Netherlands right now that farmers are furious. There's some sense that that fury is being amped up by the far right, but it's still out there. It's real. It's happening here too. What if the solutions actually worked? What if people felt they actually had a hope at a future that made them less dependent on their nitrogen supplier and not more, and their other input suppliers not more? And that's just one example. So I think I'm at time. I have a few more notes, but I can either stop here or keep going, whichever you prefer, Charles. And feel free to stop me right there.
Well, Michel, we would like to save some time for a few questions, but also for our little workshop exercise, because I think that will be interesting for us to learn from the participants how they see this topic and what they learned from their communities. But thanks a lot, Michel, because I think it was really an eye-opening for me as well, as you mentioned that we should prioritize technology that puts people and the communities in the center. Because if we go for solutions that are supporting the big industries instead of the communities, then we are again in the future, for sure, we are losing. Maybe not immediately, but for sure, then it will be again. We are stepping into the same river without making a real change. But definitely, this is a question for the future as well: how to make it on small scale.
Jules, if I can just answer that really quickly, partly because there's an anniversary coming up. I got my start in this work in October 1977 at a publication called Canadian Renewable Energy News. And 4 days from now, we celebrate the 45th anniversary of our first edition. We appeared on Halloween 1977 for the first time. And we used to have arguments in our newsroom about whether we were just about replacing one technology with another, or about whether we were also trying to set a higher standard for the technologies that we were reporting on. I hope it won't surprise you that I was on the side of the argument that said if we're not setting a higher standard, it's not worth doing. And a ban on techno-washing is such an important part of that. Technologies that support energy democracy, to the extent that we can get them. We're still going to need those big offshore wind farms, and they've got to be done right. But what about smaller energy co-ops where people actually have to say have a share? So I won't go on longer about that, although I could, but just to say this argument's been around for a very long time. And I think the next probably 5, 10, 15 years are our chance to resolve it, along with everything else. And I really hope we get it right.